Want to honor everyone's time, so we're going to start on time, and we're also recording this session so that you can use it, hopefully going forward. We're here to learn about vaccination for our children. When we think about the Jewish ethical imperatives, the primary one above all others is pikuach nefesh, the commandment to preserve life. The obligation to fulfill this commandment permits the breaking of virtually every other Jewish commandment. We see the call to save lives not just as an obligation, but as an imperative. And this is the primary Jewish reason for vaccination. Pikuach nefesh. I'd like to just start by kind of defining this term that we hear a lot. Pikuach, to open our eyes or to witness, and nefesh, which we translate to soul. One of the translations that I've seen, which actually we see first in the Mishnah, is watching over a soul. And this is also a text. I thought it was important for us just to root ourselves in Torah. And so I'll say a quick blessing, which is Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kedishanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And here in the Mishnah, you see, like all other commandments, Shabbat is overridden by the danger to life. Hence, we execute all of our needs of an ill person in mortal danger according to the word of an expert physician in that place on Shabbat. And so we're really excited today to have an expert physician. And as you can see from this text, if you can transgress Shabbat, one of our most important commandments, then sustaining life is of the utmost importance. We are here today in order to protect our children's lives. And so with that, we're very excited and honored to have Dr. Nemetski join us today. Dr. Nemetski is a pediatric emergency medical attending physician at Hackensack University Medical Center and an assistant professor of pediatrics at the Hackensack Meridian School of Medicine. She obtained her MD and PhD from the New York University School of Medicine and completed a pediatric residency at New York Presbyterian Weill Cornell Medical Center and a fellowship in pediatric emergency medicine at the Children's Hospital at Montefiore. In 2019, she joined JOMA as the first chair of Preventative Health Committee and launched their vaccination hotline and preventative health podcasts. She stepped down from her role in preventative health as the Preventative Health Committee Chair in May 2020 to devote her energies to the Medical Advisory Committee of Yeshivat Frisch and the New Jersey Yeshiva Joint Medical Committee as to work with Jewish day and high schools in and around Bergen County to reopen and stay open safely during the COVID pandemic. And with that, really, it's such an honor to be able to I tried everything to try and get this expert here, and she finally said yes, and nothing made me happier than her saying yes. And so very grateful that you're sharing your expertise and your Torah with us this morning.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. So today I'm going to talk about the COVID and the COVID vaccine in young children. So I wanted to start with some background on the effect of COVID on kids. So far in the United States, since March 2020, there have been close to 2 million COVID infections among children ages 5 to 11. This number is probably an underestimate since children were less likely to be tested than adults. Among those infected kids, there have been more than 8,000 hospitalizations. While most hospitalized children did have some comorbidities that put them at higher risk of severe illness, a third of them were previously healthy. And there have been close to 3,000 children admitted to the ICU with COVID and COVID complications. Since the start of the pandemic, there have been about 800 pediatric deaths in this country. Of those, more than 170 have been children between the ages of 5 to 11, making it the 8th leading cause of death in the United States for children in that age group. And since the emergence of Delta over the summer, it has now become the 6th leading cause of death of children in that age group. To put that in perspective, during the flu season of 2019 to 2020, which had the highest annual death toll on record, 199 children died of flu. And each year in the United States, respiratory syncytial virus, or RSV, as any of you who've had to give nebulizers to toddlers are familiar with, leads to, on average, approximately 58,000 hospitalizations and 100 to 500 deaths among children younger than 5 years old. So far, RSV has killed more children in the United States than so far COVID has killed more children in the United States than RSV and flu put together do in a year. In contrast, though, it's still less than the number of children who die of cancer, which is about 1,800 per year in this country. So the number of children who've been infected by COVID has been increasing since the emergence of Delta over the summer, and also since society has reopened. This is a graph from the CDC that breaks down the COVID cases per 100,000 population by age group. At the beginning, young children, these are the yellowish solid and dotted lines, represented a smaller percentage of the overall cases, largely because schools were closed, we kept them at home, they were very much shielded from the illness. However, with the ability of older people to be vaccinated faster than children were, and with reopening schools and reopening society last summer, just as Delta arrived, we've seen that percentage in children go up significantly, making them now the largest percentage of COVID cases. So what do we worry about with COVID in children? Yes, most kids who have COVID do have mild or asymptomatic disease, but not all. And there are some complications that seem to affect children more often. One of those is MIS-C, or multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children. This syndrome occurs a couple of weeks after the COVID infection, and it doesn't matter whether the kid was symptomatic or asymptomatic at the time of infection. It doesn't seem to make a difference. But what this is essentially an abnormal immune response to the virus. And it results in inflammation of all of the body's major organs, like the heart, lungs, kidney, brain, and GI tract. There have been more than 5,000 cases in the United States. The highest rate of cases is actually in the age group we're talking about today, the 5 to 11-year-olds. It does also disproportionately affect minorities and boys. Children who have MIS-C, the vast majority of them end up needing ICU care, and it has a fatality rate of 1 to 2%. Now, New York has not been spared the burden of MIS-C. We're actually one of the higher case rate states, likely because of the larger number of COVID cases we had earlier in the pandemic. So there have been in the state, about 200, 250 cases, with about 150 to 200 in the city itself. Another complication that we worry about with COVID, and that has actually got a lot of press because of the vaccine, is myocarditis. So myocarditis means just inflammation of the heart. Of all COVID-19 patients in all ages, it affects about 0.1% of them. And that number is similar to for children under the age of 16. So about 100 per 100,000 patients with COVID will develop myocarditis. It can either happen during the acute COVID illness, or it can also be part of the constellation of MIS-C later on. The reason this has gotten so much press is we've actually also seen some very rare cases in teenagers and young adults after their second dose of the COVID mRNA vaccines. However, this number has been much less than the numbers that we saw with actual COVID. So it's about 1 in 100,000 vaccine recipients of all ages. That number is higher in adolescent males for reasons that are not entirely clear yet, where their number is somewhere, depending on which data set you look at, somewhere between 8 and 10 per 100,000 vaccine recipients. That still means that getting COVID from the vaccine is 10 to 100 times less likely than getting myocarditis from actual COVID. Also, not all myocarditis is created equal. When we see kids who have myocarditis during acute COVID or during MIS-C, they are often very ill with very poor cardiac function. They have to be admitted to the ICU, and they often need pressors, and oftentimes they end up being intubated and put on a vent. In contrast, the kids who have myocarditis after the vaccine tend to have very mild cases. They generally resolve with just ibuprofen. The vast majority have no long-term damage, and there have been no deaths from vaccine-induced myocarditis. Myocarditis is something that we are still studying. We don't know exactly why the vaccine may, in rare cases, cause it. Similarly, we're also looking in more detail at the data for the pathological reason for myocarditis during acute COVID. But again, it's an active area of research. Another complication that we do see in children, though not as often as adults, is long COVID. So estimates vary, but it seems that about 1 in 1,000 kids, estimates vary, but it seems about 7 to 8% of children who have COVID may later go on to develop long COVID. Now, the symptoms of long COVID are similar in children as they are in adults. It's persistent fatigue, body aches, cough, shortness of breath, especially with exertion, insomnia, and also a lot of difficulty concentrating or focusing, or a brain fog. The problem is that all of these symptoms very much impair school performance. They make it hard for kids to play sports or to just play in general. And having these symptoms can cause a significant amount of anxiety in children. Now, unlike adults, almost all pediatric cases do resolve within 2 to 4 months. But if you think about it, for 4 to 12 weeks of lost school and activities can be a big deal for a kid. Imagine being a high school junior who's trying to study for the SATs while dealing with brain fog, or a middle schooler who can't join the basketball team because they get too short of breath when they play. So one of the biggest effects actually that we've seen from COVID on kids is actually the effect on schools. So this map is data as of late last week, and it shows all the known active interventions and cases of COVID in New York City public schools. So the blue dots indicate 1 or more classrooms are closed in a school due to a COVID exposure. An orange dot indicates that 1 or more classrooms are partially quarantined. A purple dot indicates that a school has 1 or more non-classroom related quarantines. Thankfully, we don't see any red dots, which would indicate a school that had to go fully remote. But you can see even this far into the pandemic, we are still seeing a lot of kids out of school. So onto the topic of this talk, mRNA vaccines. So I know most of you know this already, but I'm just going to give a brief review on what exactly mRNA vaccines do. So the COVID virus is composed of a bunch of proteins, one of which is the spike protein, which lives on the outside of the virus and is what it uses to bind to the ACE receptor in our lungs and cause infection. In order to beat a COVID infection, you need to create neutralizing antibodies against that spike protein. So what the vaccine does, it has the mRNA that codes for the spike protein. It then gets injected into the muscle cells of your upper arm. That mRNA cannot enter the nucleus. mRNA does not go into the nucleus. It's not DNA, but it does instruct the protein-producing organelles in your cell to create copies of that spike protein. The mRNA itself is degraded very quickly. It's not a very stable molecule. And then once the spike proteins are produced, after the mRNA is gone, you're not producing anymore. So they're not circulating or getting anywhere. But the spike proteins are shown to cells of your immune system, the T cells and the B cells. And the B cells then generate antibodies against the spike protein that will be hanging out and ready should you ever be exposed to the COVID virus. So how effective is the vaccine? So these graphs show the rates of COVID cases by vaccination status and age group. Now, obviously, at the time, the data that we have so far does not include the 5 to 11-year-olds because they had not yet received the EUA when this data was collected. Now, what you can see is the dotted lines are the rates of COVID in unvaccinated people, and the solid lines are the rates of COVID in fully vaccinated people. So while there are still some breakthrough cases after vaccination, you can see that it is still highly effective, that vaccinated people have much lower rates of COVID than unvaccinated people. In fact, in August, unvaccinated people had a 6.1 times greater risk of testing positive for COVID than unvaccinated people. The same is true for death due to COVID. Fully vaccinated people are much less likely to have severe illness or to die from COVID, to the point that in August, fully vaccinated unvaccinated people were 11 times more likely to die of COVID than fully vaccinated people. So what do mRNA vaccines not do? Now, there's been a bunch of myths and misinformation circulating about the vaccine, and I'm sort of want to lay some of the main ones to rest right now. So as I mentioned, mRNA vaccines have mRNA. mRNA cannot go from the cytoplasm of the cell into the nucleus, which is where your chromosomes and your genetic material is. It therefore can't actually alter your DNA. And again, the mRNA is degraded very shortly after you receive the vaccine, and we stop making spike proteins at that point. And you are not shedding spike proteins. Also, it only encodes for the spike protein, not the entire virus. So you're not making COVID viruses and you're not shedding COVID. It does not cause infertility or miscarriages. In fact, COVID infection is more likely to cause infertility or miscarriage. And a pregnant woman who is infected with COVID is 27 times more likely to die than a non-pregnant woman with COVID of the same age. Again, I don't know where the myth about the vaccine creating microchips, it does not. There's nothing electronic in the vaccine. We're not trying to track anybody by vaccines. I don't even know where that idea came from. And again, as I mentioned, it can't actually give you COVID. So what's different about Pfizer's vaccine for the younger kids? So it's a lower dose. The amount of mRNA that the younger kids are getting is only 1/3 that given to the older teenagers and adults. During the trial, Pfizer found that that lower dose was able to produce a similar amount of neutralizing antibodies as the higher dose did in teenagers and young adults, but with a lower side effect profile. Again, also the other main difference is that the buffer that the vaccine is stored in is a little bit different. The adult vaccine is stored in something called phosphate buffered saline, whereas the pediatric vaccine is stored in something called tris. As someone who spent many years working in a lab, I can tell you these two chemicals are pretty much interchangeable. They just found, probably serendipitously, that using tris instead of PBS allowed the vaccine to be a little bit more stable and easier for the pharmacist to reconstitute. So less likely of having any sort of dosing errors. And just to make sure that a child never got the adult version, the pediatric vaccine is being stored in orange bottles, orange labeled bottles, while the adult vaccine was in purple ones. So what did Pfizer find in its trial in this age group? So first, in terms of how the trial was set up. So it was a randomized placebo-controlled trial. So this means that participants were sort of grouped at random to either get the vaccine or to get just normal saline in the vial. They were able to design this trial with the benefit of information they learned before. So they already had information from the adult trial, which had 46,000 participants, as well as real-world data from the billions of vaccine recipients worldwide. And they also were able to learn from the teenager trial, which had about 2,200 participants, and then getting real-world data for the millions of teenagers who've already received it since May. So initially, Pfizer enrolled about 2,200 children and randomized them with 2/3 getting the vaccine and 1/3 getting placebo. They followed these kids for at least 2 months after getting the second dose, mainly because that 2-month range was sort of a compromise between needing to get this vaccine out quickly because we are in the middle of a pandemic, but wanting to make sure they didn't miss any essential safety signals. And generally, any sort of side effect that we've seen from a vaccine has shown up within the first 6 weeks. We haven't really seen any long-term side effects from vaccines in the past. So the thought was 2 months was a good compromise there. And this group, the initial enrollment group, is where they're getting all their vaccine effectiveness data from. Now, in August, after myocarditis emerged as a safety signal for the teenage vaccine, the FDA asked both Pfizer and Moderna actually to enroll more children in their trial to get additional safety information. So they, at that point, had to double the number of kids in the trial. And these were again randomized 2/3 vaccine, 1/3 placebo. Just because of the dates, these children were not followed quite as long as the initial set, but they all had at least 2 weeks of follow-up. So data from all 4,500 children in both groups of the trial were used for the safety analysis. So that includes about 3,000 kids who got a vaccine and 1,500 who got a placebo. And while this number does seem a little bit, may seem small, I will say that most drugs are trialed with that similar range of numbers, especially for pediatrics. So while the safety follow-up time is, between 2 to 3 months so far, it doesn't mean they're going to stop looking for safety signal. The study is actually continuing, as are all the COVID vaccine studies, for another 2 to 5 more years. So they could look for more longer term results. And additionally, as with every other vaccine and medication, it's also subject to post-market surveillance by both Pfizer and the FDA and the CDC, so that we can determine if there are any other safety signals that we don't see during the trials. So does the vaccine work? So it based on the trial data, it does work very well in this age group. They found in a vaccine efficacy of about 91% in preventing symptomatic COVID. This likely does include effectiveness against Delta, since that was the prevalent strain during the study period. They were also able to find that using what's called immunobridging studies, that even though they had lowered the dose, they still had similar numbers of neutralizing antibodies against the original COVID strain as the higher dose did in older teenagers and young adults. Additionally, they did find that this lower dose actually did achieve a high titers of neutralizing antibodies specifically against Delta. Now, there are still some questions from the trial that are unanswered. They were not able to determine whether the vaccine would prevent severe COVID or MIS-C in kids, because because these events are so rare, they didn't see cases in either the vaccine or the placebo group. So they could not do statistics on that. Also, like the adult trial, they were not screening for asymptomatic infection, so it's not possible to determine from the trial whether the vaccine is effective at presenting asymptomatic infection. Now, in terms of their safety data, as for the teenagers and the adults, the most common side effects were arm pain, some fatigue, headaches, some body aches. Those usually occurred within 1 to 2 days of vaccination and tended to resolve within 1 to 2 days thereafter. They were less severe than they saw for the older kids with the higher dose, and the young children were much less likely to have a fever after the vaccine with this lower dose. They didn't see any cases of myocarditis or pericarditis, which was another type of heart inflammation, after the vaccine. The caveat for that being that, again, this is a very rare side effect of the vaccine, so the sample size probably wasn't powered enough to catch it. They did not see any cases of MIS-C anaphylaxis after the vaccine. There were no life-threatening adverse events, and there were no deaths. In fact, none of the major adverse events they saw in either the vaccine or the placebo group could realistically be attributed to the vaccine. For example, there was one child who swallowed a penny, which would be very hard to attribute to the vaccine, but is very easy to attribute to a pediatric trial that involves 5-year-olds. So in summary, the available data strongly suggests that the vaccine is very safe for children. So what are the benefits of vaccinating young children? So there are benefits both to the individual child and to society at large. Now, again, children, by and large, do not have severe COVID, but it doesn't mean that none of them have severe COVID. And if they are vaccinated, they are much less likely to have symptomatic COVID. And the vaccines actually still do a great job of preventing infection. Yes, we're seeing breakthrough cases, but that's likely because our denominator is so large. Billions of people receive the vaccine. Even though the breakthrough rate is very tiny, that's still going to come out to a lot of breakthroughs simply because it's a large sample size. But these breakthrough cases do tend to be mild or asymptomatic. So even though your child is not likely to have severe COVID, they could still have severe COVID, and they are likely to have, a nasty cold or a flu-like illness. Why not prevent that with the vaccine? And again, while the trial couldn't determine whether it prevented MIS-C or long COVID, it's very likely that it would, simply by reducing the chance of having COVID to begin with. Now, there are also a lot of benefits to society. Vaccinating children will decrease the overall disease burden in the community. It will also help us protect our most vulnerable. While it will help protect those immunocompromised children who really are at risk for severe COVID, and even though many children are not immunocompromised, most children do live with or interact with older individuals and grandparents and parents who are at risk of severe disease. And I would hate to have a young child think that they were in any way responsible for making grandma sick. And vaccinating them will help those kids protect the people they live with. Additionally, the less COVID we have in the community at large, the faster we can get back to normal. And all of us need to get back to normal. There are also mental health benefits to vaccinating children. Vaccinated children will likely be subject to fewer quarantines, reduces the risk of school closures. And again, even though kids are not as physically affected by COVID as adults are, they do see it around them and they are afraid of it. Why not take that fear away from them? So that is another mental health benefit of vaccinating them. And again, most importantly, by reducing the burden in the community, we can go back to normal faster and kids can go back to being kids. So where are we in this process? So the vaccine has received emergency use authorization for this age group, and that took a couple of steps. So initially there was the trials. Pfizer submitted data in September. In October, the Vaccines and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee for the FDA met and voted to recommend an EUA. Shortly thereafter, the FDA authorized the EUA. And then earlier last week, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices with the CDC also voted on whether to recommend giving it. And they gave a unanimous yes. And later that night, the CDC did approve giving it. And by the middle of last week, we were getting shots into arms. So even with the EUA, there are still some open questions. We don't actually, as I mentioned, we don't actually know if the vaccine prevents viral transmission because they didn't screen for asymptomatic COVID. But based on what we're seeing in adults, it probably does. We don't have good data on what the benefits of vaccinating children who already had COVID is. The rates of reinfection in children are lower than the rates in adults, but they're not non-existent. They likely do have some benefit of getting what's called a hybrid immunity, which is someone who's had COVID and then also gets vaccinated, or someone who's vaccinated and then unfortunately does have a breakthrough case, which is usually going to be mild. Having both of those, the rates of getting reinfected after that are fairly close to zero. So that gives you the strongest immunity. So there may be some benefit for kids who already had COVID to still get vaccinated. There are also some open questions about the ideal spacing between the doses. While Pfizer chose 3 weeks between both doses, it's not entirely clear that that's actually the ideal way to create an immune response. What we have seen from countries like the UK or Canada, where they had to space out the 2 doses just because of shorter supplies, it may be that a longer spacing actually produces a stronger immune response, but that's another ongoing area of research. We don't know if kids are going to need boosters like the adults do, or if they do, when that'll happen. We also don't know for sure whether the rates of those rare side effects like myocarditis that we saw in the adolescents and young adults is going to be more, same, or less in younger children. We do think that it will probably be less, partly because young kids in general are less likely to get myocarditis than teenagers, and we're giving them a lower dose too. And then the big question, which is more likely to be answered by policymakers and governments, are will the school COVID restrictions like masks and quarantine be lifted for those kids who are vaccinated? So in summary, the vaccine, even for young children, is still safer than the virus. This is especially true for high-risk kids. So these are kids who are more likely to have severe COVID infection. And those are immunocompromised, obese kids, asthmatics, diabetics, and kids with high blood pressure. And these high-risk children were included in the trial. Also, it's especially beneficial for children who live with high-risk adults to help them protect those around them. And the vaccine is highly protective against symptomatic infection, especially for children who never had COVID. While many children in the United States already had COVID based on serologic studies or antibodies or actual testing, the vast majority of kids are still COVID naive. And again, it's hoped that vaccinating children can help us get back to normal faster. So if you want more information, there's a lot of places you can go. Here I just put some of my favorite vetted sites that will give you accurate and factual information. So the CDC, the New York Department of Health, the American Academy of Pediatrics all have great information on their website. Most children's hospitals also have great vaccine resources. I happen to really like the ones from Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And again, JOMA, or the Jewish Orthodox Women's Medical Association, also has a lot of COVID-19 information up online. And we have also recently launched a COVID vaccination information line. We can call this number and get real-time answers from physicians and other experts. These are my references, which are also great places to get more info, and I can share them all with you. And with that, any questions?
Sure. So I'm going to read off kind of what went down the list. Can you comment on the resistance between the first and the second dose?
On the what?
One of the questions was, can you comment on the resistance between the first and second dose?
Oh, as in what's the efficacy after the first dose versus after the second?
I believe so.
But they didn't actually do that analysis during this trial. I suspect because kids are young and it's harder to bring them back for an extra blood draw in the middle.
The second question, how should we think about the fact that long-term safety data doesn't exist yet?
So there are a couple of things I want to say about that. So since we have records, or since we've been keeping track, we haven't seen any long-term effects from vaccine show up more than 2 months after giving the vaccine. Does that mean that it's not possible for there to be effects later on? No, nothing's actually impossible, and we don't know anything about anything 100%. There is, though, I can't think of a biologically plausible reason for there to be long-term effects that we don't see in the first 2 months, making it very, very unlikely. We haven't seen any long-term effects over the last year because people did start getting vaccinated last December, and we haven't seen any long-term effects in adults at this point. And while I can't say with 100% certainty that there won't be, I truly suspect that there won't be, and I can't think of a biologically plausible reason why there would be.
The next question, how do you recognize symptoms of myocarditis?
Okay. So generally kids with myocarditis are going to present with chest pain. It's very unusual. So teenagers do often present with chest pain that has something to do with their heart. They'll have muscle strains or costochondritis, or they could have a lung infection that causes chest pain. For younger kids, like in that 5 to 11 age group, chest pain is actually a very rare complaint. So if a kid has chest pain, it would raise a red flag to rule out myocarditis. So often they'll present with chest pain or palpitations or shortness of breath, or feeling dizzy or lightheaded, and they could also present with vomiting. And it's not a difficult diagnosis to make. In the ER, it's pretty easy because everybody gets an EKG who says they have chest pain, but it's not that hard for a general pediatrician to order one either.
Thank you so much. This is a follow-up. As a follow-up to the first dose question, many kids will be between doses at Thanksgiving. As a doctor and a mom, would you take your kids to Thanksgiving dinner with vaccinated adults and unvaccinated or half-vax young kids?
So, I'm planning to take my kids to Thanksgiving dinner. What I would say is, again, so overall, the risk of COVID in young kids is pretty small. While some kids do get very sick and some kids do have MIS-C and a decent number of kids do have long COVID, the majority of kids do just fine. So it's more a question of the risk of them bringing COVID to those around them. So as long as the adults at the table are vaccinated, they'll also be protected from severe illness. And as long as people have been following sort of common sense guidelines to avoid COVID exposure before coming to Thanksgiving dinner, then I think it is actually safe to bring your partially vaccinated or even unvaccinated younger kids to dinner. I would just say, though, like with everything, no one should be going to a Thanksgiving dinner if they're sick. Like if you've got a fever, if you're vomiting, if your kid wakes up with a sore throat, you probably don't want to bring them to dinner, even if the thing they have isn't even COVID. It's just not a really good habit to start spreading illnesses of any kind.
We have another question here. If your kid is on medicine for ADHD, does that have an effect on getting the vaccination? Should they not take the medicine that day?
No, they can take, there really are very, very few medical contraindications to vaccination. Mainly, the only real contraindication or main contraindication is being allergic to something in the vaccine, but you don't have to stop any of your medications before the vaccine. One thing to think about, though, if you are on immunosuppressive medications or steroids, you should talk to your doctor about whether those do have to be stopped or timed differently, because they could affect your response to the vaccine. And if you've received monoclonal antibodies against COVID, you need to wait at least 3 months before getting the vaccine, because those antibodies do hang around in your system for 90 days, and they will clear the vaccine before your immune system has a chance to react to it.
Thank you. This just came in the chat. Were there any other clinical trials in other countries with longer term data?
So the vaccine has only been around since last winter and spring. So it only started being given to children at the time this trial started last spring. So no one has longer term data than this.
Sorry, I'm having technical difficulties. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. The other question, is there any advantage for a 5-year-old to receive the vaccination from their pediatrician versus from their primary, such as Walgreens?
So, gotcha. So that that will very much depend on the parent's comfort level. So, you know, we're used to getting vaccines from our pediatrician, so a lot of parents are just more comfortable going to their pediatrician. So that may be one benefit. I will say that the pharmacists do also have equipment needed to treat any, you know, major allergic reaction. They do have EpiPens and everything there, just like you have at the pediatrician's office. So it is still safe. There are some kids and adults too, if there's suspicion that they might have an allergic reaction based on prior reactions or just other comorbidities, they may feel more comfortable getting the vaccine by either their pediatrician, their allergist or immunologist, or in more of a hospital setting. So a lot of it is, so that's where it would be a medical difference, but for the most part, it's a level of comfort and which setting is more appropriate for your kids. Pediatricians are more used to giving vaccines to very resistant 5-year-olds than pharmacists are. So for some people, that might be more comfortable.
Next question. We have a 11-and-a-half-year-old. The 5 to 11-year dosage is 10, and the 12-year-old dosage is 30. Will he need to get revaccinated at the higher dose once he turns 12? Has there been any guidance on this issue? So the guidance so far has, so the reason that the dosing for vaccines is a little bit different than dosing for medications. For most medications, pediatric dosing is based on weight versus vaccines is based on age, just because that has more to do with the difference in your immunological response is more based on age than based on size. So if you are 11-and-a-half, you should get the 5 to 11-year-old dose, that lower dose. Once you receive that lower dose, you will be, once you get 2 doses, you are considered fully vaccinated. You're not going to have to repeat the series at the higher dose, unless for whatever reason it turns out that kids also need boosters, in which case it would be a booster dose, not necessarily revaccinating. If you turn 12 in between the 2 doses, whether you get both lower doses or one lower dose and then the higher dose, you would still be considered fully vaccinated. You wouldn't have to repeat it. Is there a negative reason to give your child a vaccine if they've had COVID? So it is, so people who've previously had COVID are a little more likely to have worse side effects from the vaccine, and those are the immediate side effects. They're a little more likely to feel very lousy the next day, although they'll still be fine 2 to 3 days later. Both the adult, all of the vaccine trials did look into not necessarily getting the vaccine after COVID, but they did look to see if the vaccine could predispose you to a more severe illness if you got COVID afterwards, or what's called a disease enhancing response. And they did rule that out based on the trial. It does not do that. Now, in terms of people who already had COVID, in the trial, in both the adults, the teenagers, and the pediatric trials, there were some trial participants who, based on antibody titers that were done at the time of enrollment, did show evidence of having previously been infected with COVID. There were no severe effects for those people either. So the short answer is, if you already had COVID and you get the shot, you might feel a little bit worse the next day, but you'll still be fine after that. There's no serious risk to it. And I can tell you from my own experience, my whole family had COVID.
many of the people I work with had COVID, which is, I guess, sort of an inevitable consequence of working in an ER in the Northeast in March of 2020. They've all been vaccinated. There were no serious issues thereafter.
Just going to read this from the chat. I've spoken to vaccinated adults who have had long-term impacts from the vaccine and who's worked with a doctor who has seen this in others. Is anyone studying this?
So there are a lot of people who are studying this. Again, as I said, nothing is 100%. For all vaccines, there is a very, very small, but not zero risk, like just for all medications, there is a small, but not zero risk of a significant side effects. Most of those are all generally, while they may last a while, they all are generally seen within the first 2 months. And it is an active area of study. People are definitely studying this, are looking into it. They're looking into the pathology of this, just like we study adverse events from all medications and all vaccines. But still the rate of those everything is a risk benefit calculation, right? There's a risk of there's a very, very small risk of a bad side effect from a vaccine, and there's a larger risk of a bad effect from COVID. So you have to kind of, you calculate that risk benefit based on your individual circumstances, and also based on the general trial data, which overall shows that the risk of the vaccine is much, much, much smaller than the risk of the virus itself.
We're going to dive a little bit into this question at the end, but it's interesting to ask you as well. Do you have any advice for how to help convince hesitant parents to vaccinate their children so that they can feel safer in our Sunday school? My community is likely to be vaccinating their kids, but I know there are some people who are hesitant, whose kids don't have any medical issues that would stop them.
Okay. So in general, I wouldn't force anyone to vaccinate their kids, right? There's still some, personal liberty here. I would try to present the data and do the best explanation you can of why the vaccine is safer than the virus and why there are benefits to vaccinating children, even though children are not as high risk with severe illness as adults. For some people, there are those who are not going to vaccinate no matter what, for whatever beliefs they have, whether it's some weird conspiracy theory about microchips or some bad personal experience they're just not going to get past. I wouldn't necessarily spend a lot of time trying to argue with people like that, because you're really just not going to agree, and you're more likely to harm your friendship that way. And it's really not worth harming a friendship over. Now, for people who are on the fence, there are going to be some people who just need to have a little bit more time. So what I would do is I would show the data that we have now, explain, what we know, what we don't know, why we do believe, based on the information we have now, that there is a benefit to vaccinating, and it's much safer to vaccinate than to get COVID. And I would also stress the fact that everybody's going to get COVID. This is a highly contagious airborne respiratory illness with a huge animal reservoir. We are never actually going to be able to eradicate it, even if we vaccinate everybody. There will be new variants, and again, there's an animal reservoir that can still give it right back to us. So it's not realistic to think that your child is never going to be exposed to COVID. They will. So it's not a choice. So your choices are: don't be vaccinated and get COVID, in which case you're more likely to have a more severe illness and more long-term effects. Be vaccinated and don't get COVID, because again, even though there are breakthrough cases, the vaccine does work very, very well. Or be vaccinated, but then have a breakthrough case that is very mild or asymptomatic. Of those three options, the two that include being vaccinated are by far the safer ones. And there's no fourth option of don't get the vaccine and don't get COVID. It's not actually going to be possible to avoid exposure to COVID for the rest of your life. So once you sort of explain those basic facts really to people, and then you can go through what the risks of the vaccine are, what the benefits of the vaccine are, and then what the risks of the virus are. And I do believe that overall, the benefits of the vaccine outweigh the risk, and the risk of the virus certainly outweigh the risk of the vaccine. And that would be the argument I would present. But again, For some people, they're still going to have some hesitancy, or they still might need to wait to get some more real world data, in which case I would just really try to be very respectful and kind of be ready to revisit that conversation when they feel more comfortable, or when there's more data, there's enough data available to make them feel more comfortable. The good news about this is there are enough parents who are rushing to get their kids vaccinated that we're going to have real world data from millions of kids very, very, very soon. So a lot of this is not going to be a hesitancy. Like, a lot of the people who are on the fence will probably find themselves much more comfortable with it very soon, once we have mountains of real world data to present to them. In the same way that we saw for the teenage vaccine, there was a big push when it was first out for those parents who were waiting eagerly to vaccinate their kids and kind of were the very early adopters and jumped on it right away. And then it kind of plateaued a bit. And then, 2 to 3 months later, when we had all this real world data and those teenagers were being able to go and do normal teenage things without worrying about being quarantined, and they weren't having, they weren't growing a third head, they were doing just fine and not getting sick. Then you started seeing later on in the summer, a lot of those parents who were on the fence were like, okay, you know what, I'm going to go and vaccinate my teenager now too. I think we're going to see the same thing happen with younger kids, that we have this group of early adopters who are all vaccinating their kids this week. And then we'll have more data about how those kids are doing in December and January. And then at that time over the winter, you'll start seeing those parents who are on the fence start vaccinating their kids too.
We're going to have 3 more questions. Given where we are with boosters in adults, should we expect that children will be asked to get boosters over time as well?
It's hard to know, simply because kids' immune system is a little bit different than adults. And in general, kids are also exposed to a lot of other respiratory viruses, including those, what I like to call corona light, like the older coronaviruses that we saw before 2019 that weren't causing severe illness. And some of those, and one of the theories about why kids aren't getting quite as sick with COVID as adults are, is that they do have some immunity to those older coronaviruses, and there's a little bit of crossover. So whether kids will need boosters, or whether the combination of their initial doses, the fact that they're a little less susceptible to COVID to begin with, and the fact that they're constantly being primed with those other less serious coronaviruses will allow them to maintain their immunity longer. It's just, we're not going to know until we see what things look like in 6 months to a year from now.
This is actually a personal question for me as well. Any guesses on when they will approve vaccines for younger than 5?
What they've been saying is that Pfizer plans to submit that data to the FDA in the beginning of 2022. So hopefully maybe February-ish, if things go well. Again, it's still a clinical trial, and they're still dealing with the smaller the participants, the harder it is to run the trial. Because you do have to bring kids in to get the vaccine, to get swabbed, come back for blood work, and they've got school and they've got this, and their parents so it's just, and kids really are not usually enthusiastic about going to get a shot or a blood test. So
I'll just say lollipops helped for my kid yesterday. It was very helpful.
Stickers are good. So but if everything goes on track, it should be hopefully February-ish.
I think this is, as a parent, do I want to look to see that my child's vaccine comes in an orange vial? Anything else I want to look for in a public location? Okay.
So in general, the pharmacist who's preparing the vaccine really shouldn't make a mistake. But again, people are human and mistakes do happen. You can ask to see the vial. Like there's no reason you can't. If it's a place that's doing both doses or other vaccines at the same time, then you may want to. If, God forbid, there is a mix-up, I will say that even with the higher dose, their side effects might be a little worse the next day, but they're unlikely to have major harm, just because in the phase 1 of this trial, they did test 3 different, like 30 micrograms, 20 micrograms, and 10 micrograms on kids. So they didn't see major effects with any of the doses, but what they saw the most mild effects were with the 10. So they chose the lowest dose that gave the lowest side effects, but still generated enough antibodies. but it's not unreasonable to ask to see the vial. You can certainly do that. I don't think the pharmacist will, I mean, they shouldn't be offended. We do I mean, even in the hospital, we have what's called like the switch cheese model of medical errors where, you know, there could be a hole in every part of the system, but you never want to let them line up. And we do check each other all the time. So they're probably used to this. Other things to just look out for if you're in a setting, you just want to make sure you're in a place your kid's going to feel comfortable with. If you have a child who really, really hates needles, you probably want to choose a vaccine site that is used to giving, you know, shots to very resistant kids, that maybe they have, you know, more child-friendly atmosphere, make sure they have the lollipop and the stickers. Like that's sort of what I would do in terms of what you're looking for. And as always, like you're getting any medication or any injection, you want to go to a place that looks like they're organized and running things well, and, you know, they're cleaning things and changing gloves. I would be very, I don't think you're going to, this is not just for the COVID vaccine. You don't want to get medications or a shot or anything in a place that looks like a zoo. So that would basically be what I would be looking for. But most of the sites, I mean, they've been doing this for a year now. By now, many of them are running like well-oiled machines. They're used to this.
Good. I have one last question here. In the short term, as you said, much more info will appear for kids and their responses. Will that info be on those websites like the children's hospitals that you shared with us?
It should be. Some hospitals, some sites update more often than others. You should also be able to see that information on the CDC website, because they'll be able to update based on what they get from, with any vaccine, there's the VAER system where anybody, a doctor or a layperson or anyone can actually upload a, you know, enter what they think might be a vaccine side effects. I will say, because it's open to everyone, many of the things on VAERS are just unreliable. Like people have entered things like, I got into a car accident on the way home from getting my shot. That must be because of the shot. And some of them are just really entered by lawyers who are hoping to sue somebody. But everything that is entered on VAERS is investigated by the CDC. And they do update, they do post the results of what they see. This is part of the way we found out that myocarditis was a safety signal in the teenagers. I do expect there to be, so one of the places that actually does a really great job updating data on this is Israel. So a good source of information is actually the Israeli Ministry of Health, because they do have their nationalized healthcare system. They're really into high tech there. They're very good at collating data and gathering it and disseminating it very quickly. So I should actually add their website to my slides, but that would be a good place to go. Mm-hmm.
Great. Thank you so much. I wanted to just share a few things about trying to be influencers for other parents. So I'll just show this, you know, really briefly. This is taken from the CDC, and as we were talking about this in terms of pikuach nefesh and trying to save lives, some of the advice, and this came up, the question was, when you're talking to other parents or people in terms of vaccination, to listen to their questions with empathy, to ask open-ended questions to explore their concerns, to ask permission to share information, which we'll follow up with after this incredible presentation, to help them find their reason to get vaccinated, whatever that might be for that person, that parent, to help make their vaccination happen. And we found that time and time again, giving people, you know, really easy access in order to get vaccinated at a site. Even signing someone up for their own appointment has been really helpful in becoming influencers in vaccination. And the last piece, well, not the last piece, I just want to, before we do this last piece, I just want to really thank Dr. Nemetski so much for all this information. It is extremely helpful, and we are so grateful for you willing to take the time. I know you're extremely busy, and we really feel extremely blessed. And with that, I'm just going to introduce our assistant rabbi, Rabbi Becca Weintraub, who's going to share a blessing with us as we move into this new phase. Wait, you're muted. There we go.
Hi, everyone. So a moment of blessing. I'll invite everyone just take a deep breath. And I think this is a moment many of us have been waiting for a very, very long time. So we say, Adonai Rofe Kol Basar Mafli Lasot, God who heals all of humanity and creates wonders before us. Thank you for sustaining us and bringing us to this awe-filled moment. Bless us and our children as we become your partners in healing our world. Give our children courage as they receive this vaccine, which is a gift of science, a miracle in our time. Let this be a fresh start full of freedom, connection, and most of all, health for all as we take on the sacred task of Pikuach Nefesh, saving lives, elevating your holy spark within each and every human soul. Amen.
So we just want to thank everyone for participating and for all the congregations that we collaborate with on these sessions for you. The next session that we have is with Dr. Ron Taffel on December 15th, I believe 7:30 p.m. And it's on gratitude for our children. Again, thank you so much to Dr. Nemetski and to all the other congregations that we partner with to bring you these sessions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.